Here we move slightly forward in time to an extraordinary image which could be said to be the beginning of the high art sculptural tradition in England as it's come down to us, as it will be interpreted by critics like Orpen in the early part of the 20th century just gone. This dates from 1290 and is an effigy made by William Torrell, one of his first ones, a life-size bronze. It's an extraordinary piece. Imagine it's incredibly heavy, highly wrought, the full length of a man's course, metallic, powerful, but again you have, amidst the finery and pertinences of the form, a strength, a physical power, a solidity, even in repose. Ideologically it's supposed to show the redemption of a Christian and knightly grace in the context of death, but I think it very much relates to, in its three-dimensionality, many of the images that we've seen before. So powerful, even in its metallic form, that it survived the better part of 1,000 years and will probably be extant 1,000 years from now. This is the bringing together of stoicism in form, grace, solidity as to material, truth to materials, to use a modern slogan, and the quiet power of the English three-dimensional tradition. Here we have an image in bronze again, highly weathered, of Richard II, the subject of a Shakespeare play. Again very much seen in the Christian vogue, a Christian knightly monarch, looking slightly meek and humble, how you were supposed to look in the era. Very strongly three-dimensional, good line, powerful squat nature of the features and upper shoulders. He's depicted slightly as an apostle, but again these were parts of the convention of the period. But again we return to this theme of compactness, stoicism, truth to material, and solidity. In all of English, and to a slightly lesser extent British sculpture, there is this deep, quiet and reverberating sense of power in the depiction of the face, the upper body, or the entire frame. I have an image from the 14th century from Cambridgeshire, from a provincial church. It strikes me as a very Germanic image, this one, almost completely three-dimensional, but with a certain element of relief, but the relief becomes ever more studied, ever more withdrawn. The figures are bursting through into three-dimensionality. This is a scene of the ascent of the Christ after death, after the resurrection. He appears both as a victim and as a monarch or celestial king. The Roman soldiers, who actually look like medieval warriors of the time, because those are the forms or archetypes upon which the anonymous sculpture is drawing, fall back in amazement and consternation before this risen being who's almost sort of walking out of the relief to what is perceived as a semblance of glory. Here we have a terracotta from the 1540s. It doesn't really relate to pure English art that much, but what we see here is an opening out in the Tudor period to continental influence. So we're dealing with a sort of re-Europeanization or a return of the sculpture of the ancient world in the form of a bust relating to the Roman Emperor and once conqueror of Britain, Julius Caesar. But it's the opening to intellectual ideas on the continent. And although you could say that in the Middle Ages we internalised lots of continental ideas, here are Italian sculptors coming over the behest of the court, structures of the day, to bring high Renaissance material within the purview of the English tradition. And from now on we see a mixing of what existed before and the high art of the Renaissance coming over to Britain and England in order to curry its trade. We see a sort of fusion of various European styles as the whole of the European civilization is beginning to wean itself away from the Middle Ages and is beginning to look towards the creation of early modern Europe. And you have this sensibility which grows up during this century and the one to come after it, which involves a gradual de-Christianization, a return of the classical in various dimensions. This is the classicism of the ancient world, and a slight mobility and a loosening of the rigid forms of medieval and post-medieval art. I have another example of the High Renaissance. It's the lightish spirit of Michelangelo, come over to England, hopped over, and in wood. It's from King's College Chapel in Cambridge, forcing house and academic stamping ground of the upper class elite of the time, of course. And again, it's the belief in all things Italian and the Renaissance style and spirit, in stone, in bronze, in wood, in jewellery, in literature and elsewhere. So we're taking, during this period, whole handfuls of Renaissance sensibility from the southern part of Europe and bringing it across and internalising it as part of the national tradition. Now what's really happening here is two things. We're opening up to a humanism which is European, we're opening up to certain post-Christian sensibilities, and yet at the same time we're going back to certain of the conceits and styles of the ancient world, but we don't know entirely what they were, so we are stylising what we imagine the ancient craftsmen did in bas-relief, in 2 dimensions, in 3 dimensions, and we're bringing it forward several thousand years as Christianity begins to loosen its hold upon the European imagination, and we connect via Southern Europe and its cultural influences with the classical world. Here we see a major sculpture from 1592 by Gerard Johnson the Elder. The tradition is well advanced now. This sculpture deals with death, of course. An enormous amount of monumental masonry and 3-dimensional sculpture deals with the relief of death, both inside and outside Christianity. The power and solemnity of the tomb or mausoleum, the desire to incarnate oneself as a living corpse after death, the power of a provincial noble family to be seen for the entire community, possibly for hundreds of years. This is the Southampton tomb at Titchfield, and yet it's also of a very important patron in the history of English art. This is the 3rd Earl, who was Shakespeare's patron. The arts in all eras have to obtain money because they can't finance themselves in a completely freestanding way. In this era, aristocrats and very rich individuals from the upper class would give money and be seen to give money to the arts as part of an organic tradition, but they always had a certain element of self-interest, and they always wanted their family, such as through the vehicle of a tomb like this, to be the recipients of their largesse. So the money is given, an enormous tomb of massive monumentality is built to a local dignitary, and you can sense the power in this church. Not only is it very big, very tall, very solid, there are these spear-like menhirs that on the 4 corners of the tomb that make these stone corpses in state look like sort of images from ancient Egypt almost. It's a sort of grandiloquence and power of an aristocracy that had life and death powers over the rest of society, brooked no word against them, and were totally in charge. It's also the sign of a ruling group that is completely self-confident in this world and what they presume.